Hello, everyone, and welcome to the 2022-2023 Feinberg Family Distinguished Lecture Series, Confronting Empire, a year-long series on U.S. imperialism and anti-imperialism that looks at U.S. empire from the roots as a settler colonial state to overseas expansion to the wars of the 21st century. I'm Amy Goodman, host of Democracy Now! It is such an honor to be with all of you today. Tonight's program is presented by the UMass Amherst History Department in collaboration with the Ellsberg Initiative for Peace and Democracy. More than 36 university and community partners have co-sponsored this year's series. I invite you to take a look at the chat for the full list. This biennial series is made possible thanks to Kenneth R. Feinberg and Associates. We're broadcasting from the campus of the University of Massachusetts Amherst, which was founded and built on the unceded homelands of the Pocumtuck Nation on the land of Norwotug community, and made possible through the Morrill Land Grant Act, which sold portions of land from 82 Native nations to fund the building of land-grant universities, including UMass Amherst. For Spanish interpretation, please select the globe icon and select Spanish. To listen to the entire event in English, select English Live. Closed captions in English are also available. So to begin tonight, we're going to be hearing from two remarkable people. We'll be joined by the 1992 Nobel Peace Prize laureate, Rigoberta Menchú Tum. We'll also be joined by the American author, journalist with the Los Angeles Times, and then with the Financial Times and the Washington Post, Vincent Bevins. I'll be introducing him more fully later, but I thought we'd start with the trailer of the film, When the Mountains Tremble.
If Guatemala came unstuck, it would have serious economic repercussions throughout Central America.
We must continue to encourage peace among the nations of Central America. No amount of reform will bring peace so long as guerrillas believe they will win by force.
The government of the United States is not going to permit a red Soviet republic between Texas and the Panama Canal.
Me llamo Rigoberta Menchú, indígena quiché del pueblo de Guatemala. Soy campesina, soy cristiana, soy un sobreviviente de mi familia. Les voy a contar mi historia, que es la historia de todo el pueblo de Guatemala.
The pressure of the mass movement for change and the inflexibility of the military brought the country to a tension that was unbearable.
El resto es historia.
And there you saw our keynote presenter, Dr. Rigoberta Menchú Tum, in the film When the Mountains Tremble by the remarkable filmmaker Pamela Yates. And I encourage everyone to watch that whole film, but not right now, because you have the woman in the flesh before you to tell her life story. Yes, Dr. Rigoberta Menchú has been such an inspiration for me for so many decades. She participated in the farm worker movement in Guatemala as a young woman. Her seminal testimonial, her book, I, Rigoberta Menchú, an Indian Woman in Guatemala, denounced President Reagan's support for government attacks on Mayan communities. Over 150,000 indigenous people were killed by the US-backed Guatemalan forces in the 1980s. Rigoberta Menchú, in her incredibly brave work as she stood up to power, won her the Nobel Peace Prize in 1992. Right now, Dr. Menchú Tum is going to present a speech, and then we're going to hear from Vincent Bevins, an American journalist who has written about Indonesia, Brazil, and so much more. And then we're going to have a conversation and invite you to join and ask questions. But first, it is my honor to present Dr. Rigoberta Menchú Tum.
Muchas gracias. Es un gran honor estar aquí con ustedes. Soy Rigoberta Menchú Tum. Soy una activista social. Creo que ese es el título más importante que yo tengo, porque he nacido de las luchas, de la resiliencia de los pueblos indígenas, de la reivindicación de los derechos, incluyendo el derecho a la vida. Y soy parte de un país que vivió en plena vida todo lo que fue la Guerra Fría. Y creo que desde el Plan Cóndor que impulsó Kissinger en América Latina, murieron muchas personas, se fortalecieron muchos grupos de extrema derecha, y sobre todo se hicieron planes para matar. Pienso que Guatemala no solo fue víctima de un plan contrainsurgente, ese plan que incluía precisamente el aniquilamiento de muchas comunidades, de muchos pueblos, especialmente atacaba los dirigentes sociales, los dirigentes campesinos, los dirigentes cristianos, las dirigentes mujeres, porque en aquellos años ya había una gran participación de las mujeres, especialmente las mujeres mayas. Y bueno, dentro de mi historia hay mucho más, pero lo más importante quizá fue que no me callé, no me silencié yo mismo, sino rompí el silencio. Romper el silencio en aquellos años era de mucho riesgo. Sin embargo, me tocó romper el silencio. Y ese silencio también llevó la muerte de mis padres. Mi papá, Vincent Menchú, fue quemado vivo en la Embajada de España el 31 de enero del año 80. Mi madre fue secuestrada. Hasta la fecha, cuánto me gustaría conocer dónde está mamá, dónde quedaron sus restos, en qué fosa común puede estar. Igual como me tocó perder a mi hermano Víctor, mi hermano Patrocinio, a mi cuñada María y a muchos otros miembros de mi familia. Sin embargo, la historia mía también sirvió para reivindicar la memoria colectiva de los pueblos. Por eso es que agradezco mucho este programa de la Universidad de Massachusetts, especialmente que involucre los jóvenes en la historia. Creo que la historia nos pertenece a las generaciones que nos tocó ser protagonista del tiempo, pero también involucra a los jóvenes como protagonistas del futuro. Nada puede pasar mejor en el futuro si no tenemos, si tenemos una memoria histórica. Y gracias a Pamela, por ejemplo, a Pamela Yats, que se hizo Las montañas tiemblan, pero también gracias a las personas que ayudaron a formar el libro Me llamo Rigoberta Menchú y así me nació la conciencia. Pero gracias a todas las personas que a mí me dieron la oportunidad de hablar, me dieron la oportunidad de llorar mi dolor y convertirme en una lideresa, y por eso creo que el tiempo es que deba juzgar todo. Hubo política de horror en América Latina apoyado por Estados Unidos. Sus dirigentes más visibles en esto, desde Kissinger, Reagan, y las guerras sucesivas que ocurrieron, las invasiones, las intervenciones, desde la intervención del 54 en Guatemala, se vivió la política norteamericana. En su momento, todos creían que éramos anti-norteamericanos, pero en realidad no éramos anti-norteamericanos, solamente criticábamos y dábamos a conocer las políticas norteamericanas en el marco de la Guerra Fría, en el marco de la guerra de las potencias, y que llevó muchas vidas. Pero lo más importante de esto es la participación de las mujeres. Yo felicito los procesos legales que al final llevamos a los tribunales guatemaltecos, como la lucha de los sigiles. Es importante ver el juicio por delitos de lesa humanidad que llevaron los sigiles en su propio idioma, después de tantos años de guardar las evidencias de los crímenes, o la lucha de las hermanas mayas quechís de Sepurzarco, que es otro juicio que ganamos, o la lucha de los propios sobrevivientes de la masacre de la Embajada de España el 31 de enero del año 80, donde fue quemado vivo mi padre. Esta lucha que llevó muchas décadas, muchos años, sin embargo, fuimos a los tribunales, defendimos esos derechos, escribimos esa memoria histórica. ¿Para qué? Para que los jóvenes no vuelvan a cometer esos crímenes, pero también por la dignidad de la verdad legítima de los pueblos. No solo hay que luchar por una verdad, sino que la verdad sea legítima. Finalmente, aquí estamos construyendo la participación de las mujeres, construyendo las democracias, enfrentando los rezagos de las guerras, especialmente la Guerra Fría, especialmente el conflicto armado en Guatemala, que nos dejó divididos, que nos dejó con mucho dolor, pero también dejó muchas huellas de violencia. Por eso, con el premio Nobel, yo he luchado, he hecho compromiso de luchar por una paz como educación, como cultura, como identidades, como el respeto a la vida misma, y no solamente por denunciar las guerras, porque las guerras lo utilizaron los poderes en contra, pero la población tiene que hacer un compromiso de paz como armonía, de paz como educación, como paz, de paz como respeto, respeto mutuo. Y creo que mucho hemos avanzado, pero la historia lo dejamos a nuestras nuevas generaciones. Nosotros sentamos unos principios de lucha contra la violencia. Sentamos unos principios, dejamos unas huellas por la dignidad humana y dejamos la historia escrita de muchas maneras, de manera verbal, de manera escrita en la academia, pero más felicito esta labor que se hace en la academia, porque lo que está escrito también es una huella para la humanidad. Así que felicito a la Universidad de Massachusetts por este espacio, Felicito a los estudiantes, felicito a los profesores, a Diana Sierra, a Jesse Johnson, gracias por esta oportunidad, a Amy Goodman, que nos va a conducir hoy, a Vincent, que seguramente tiene mucho que decir en relación a la historia de América Latina. Nosotros lo vivimos en piel y sin embargo salimos adelante. Yo soy una mujer lideresa, que no tengo ningún rencor del pasado, que no me gusta la revancha, no me gusta, sino me gusta la plenitud de la vida. Me gusta que vivamos limpio y sanamente, mentalmente, espiritualmente y socialmente. Muchas gracias.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rigoberta Menchú Tum. And I have so many questions I want to ask you, as I'm sure so many hundreds of people in the audience do as well. But first, we're going to also hear from Vincent Bevins, an American journalist and writer. From 2011 to 2016, he worked as a foreign correspondent based in Brazil for the Los Angeles Times, after working previously in London for the Financial Times. In 2017, he moved to Jakarta, Indonesia, and began covering Southeast Asia from there, and then began his book in 2018. He was writing for the Washington Post, The Jakarta Method, Washington's anti-communist crusade and the mass murder program that shaped our world. The book about Cold War violence in Indonesia and Latin America, his work mostly focusing on international politics, the world economy, and global culture. Vincent Bevins, the floor is yours.
Yes. Thank you so much for that introduction, and thank you for the invitation. It's really an honor to speak after Rigoberta, and hope I can do my best to provide some of this context that I was discovered working on this book, The Jakarta Method. But since this is a series about imperialism, I want to quickly note that unlike what I was taught in high school, U.S. imperialism did not begin in 1898 with the Spanish-American War. It was not a phase that started late in U.S. history. It started in 1776 with the very foundation of the United States. Imperialism started in North America. The vast majority of what is now the United States was conquered, not by the British Empire, but the United States government. I'm sure other speakers in the series have covered that very well. I always like to push back against what I was told as a child. But since I will be talking primarily about the second half of the 20th century, or more specifically about Jakarta, this metonym, this real-life literary device that connects cases of mass murder all around the world, I think it makes sense to really start in 1945 with the end of World War II. A moment in history at which I think it is correct, it is useful to divide the world into three parts, as was common at the time. You had the First World, which was the rich and powerful countries of the North Atlantic and their allies. All of these countries had become rich during periods in which they practiced overseas imperialism. You had the Second World, which was the countries of the formerly communist world led by Moscow, and the countries that were either liberated or conquered by the Red Army, depending on how you want to look at it, during World War II. And then you had the rest of humanity, the so-called Third World. And though this has been forgotten since, the Third World at the time was an entirely optimistic, forward-looking, idealistic project which sought to reformulate the rules of the global economy, which sought to put the peoples of the Third World alongside the First World in what was believed to be their rightful place and what was believed to be their natural destination after the end of formal European colonization of the countries of Africa, Asia, and Latin America. Now, at this time, at the end of World War II, the United States emerges as by far the most powerful country in human history. It is now the leader of the first world, and this is a pretty quick transformation for a relatively young country. The United States emerges onto the global scene with far more power than the countries of Western Europe that had formerly colonized much of the globe, far more power than the second world led in Moscow, and much more power, of course, than the countries of the third world. Now, unlike the British Empire, the United States did not have a clandestine service that was tasked with collecting information around the world and generating outcomes and intervening throughout the globe in order to create conditions which were favorable to the United States. There was no MI6 in the history of the United States government. But in 1945, the United States does create the CIA, officially to collect information to be delivered to the president, but then which also begins to act covertly to shape outcomes around the world in accordance with the perceived interests of the United States government. Now, at the very beginning, the CIA was supposed to take on the second world. The problem with that was that they repeatedly failed. When they tried to actually get behind the so-called Iron Curtain, when they tried to penetrate into areas controlled by Moscow and its allies, they failed repeatedly, sent many men to their deaths, and basically came up against that very Iron Curtain. And so they turned to the third world. And even the most sympathetic biographers of the early members of the CIA, even the most sympathetic historians of the CIA admit that the men at the in charge of the CIA didn't really know much about the global South at all. They turned to the global South, or at the time the third world, not knowing much about it and not knowing how to interact with it. And even third world leaders that were on the radical left, even men like Ho Chi Minh in Vietnam, Mao Zedong in China, they did not know either how the United States was going to interact with the third world. It was Ho Chi Minh and Mao both hoped that the United States would form some kind of a friendship with them. In general, the countries of the global South, including those led by communist leaders, did not want to pick a fight with the United States. They hoped that the United States would stay true to its professed Republican revolutionary ideals, Republican with a small r, rather than fall back into the practices that had been so integral to its expansion in North America, that is imperialism. So this was not clear in 1947, 1948, even to communist leaders. Now, no country better exemplifies this ambiguity, this uncertainty at the heart of US foreign policy towards the global South, better than Indonesia, which is now the fourth largest country in the world by population, the world's largest Muslim majority country, and a nation which spans across 13, 15, 17, 19,000 islands, depending on how you want to count it, in the territory that used to be controlled by Dutch imperialism in Southeast Asia. And when this country was founded through the anti-colonial struggle against the Netherlands, the United States appeared to believe, the United States believed at the very beginning of what became the Cold War, that Indonesia could be an ally. Indonesia had expelled the Dutch in a revolutionary war. Communists existed, but they had been suppressed in that revolutionary process. And something called the Jakarta Axiom at the time in the early Cold War essentially stated that countries like this, countries that stayed neutral, that were not at risk of an immediate communist takeover, that did not want to be direct allies with the United States, but also were not allied directly with the Soviet Union, could be acceptable friends of the United States in the second half of the 20th century. Now, I said earlier that the CIA had wasted a lot of time and money and human lives trying to break into, mess with, screw up things in the second world. But by 1953, things change for the CIA. They get their first victory from their perspective. They succeed in making a coup happen in Iran, partially at the behest of the British, partially to stop a supposed communist, the supposed possibility that there could be a communist takeover in the country, And as is often the case in US foreign policy, oil was a big part of the reason the United States got involved in Iran. Now, this was seen as a big victory in the White House. President Eisenhower, who had just taken over, thought that he had sort of discovered the cheat code to geopolitics. You don't have to send any men to die in a war. We've engineered an outcome in Iran at basically no cost to the United States. In the US, at least, the media is not really telling people about it. People certainly know in Iran, people know in Indonesia, people know across Latin America, but it seems to be this could be a way to go. We engineer coups in the global South to shape outcomes in accordance with our perceived interests. Then next comes Guatemala, another US-backed coup. And this is important for my purposes because this is the first point in the Cold War that I found that the US directs the local government to carry out the intentional mass murder of communists or people that are accused of being communists. This happens right after the 1954 coup in Guatemala. Now, that Jakarta axiom that I briefly described is now out the door. The idea that neutral countries can be tolerated is gone by 1953 and 54. The new policy coming from the White House is either you're with us or you're against us. If you're not specifically, explicitly allied with the United States, you will be marked for possible elimination if it is convenient to us. Now, US policy towards Indonesia changes in 1955 for two reasons. One, Indonesia hosts the Bandung Conference, which is the first formal instantiation of the Third World Movement, bringing together representatives of about half the world's population, really putting into practice the idea that the world should be reformulated along the lines of real decolonization rather than just formal decolonization. And then the Indonesian Communist Party starts to do better and better in elections. And we know now from declassified documents that even the CIA and MI6 knew that this was a moderate, unarmed socialist party that had no intention of carrying out a revolution in the near future, and that was winning more votes because they were simply convincing people to vote for them. We know that by 1958, the CIA and MI6 knew that the Indonesian Communist Party would have won free and fair elections had they been allowed to take place. But they did not, because starting in 1955, the United States begins a series of attempts to derail the version of Indonesia that has been created by the anti-colonial struggle that has been elaborated so eloquently by President Sukarno, who has been at the forefront of the Third World Movement. The first thing that they try in Indonesia is to funnel money to a right-wing Muslim political party, hoping that will stop the Indonesian Communist Party from doing so well in elections. That does not work. In 1958, they foment and then participate in a civil war, sending US pilots to drop bombs on Indonesian civilians, killing citizens, all the while telling the Indonesian government that they are not involved in the civil war. The Indonesian left is loudly proclaiming that they are. The Indonesian left is proved correct when a CIA pilot crash lands and is identified as an American in 1958. And this attempt is now out the window. They have to come up with something else. So from 1958 to 1965, the Indonesian military, instead of being confronted at war by the United States government, is brought to the United States for training. And the United States develops very close relationships with the United States, with the Indonesian military, I believe sort of bringing a Latin American script to the Indonesian context. This is something that had been happening in Latin America for a very long time, forming close relationships with military officers and really building a deep friendship so that if needed, the military could be called upon to act in accordance with US interests and often in accordance with their own interests too. The field of incentives was shaped to allow for those two things to overlap. So with the death of John F. Kennedy in the beginning of the Johnson administration in the early 60s, policy shifts again towards Indonesia. They bring in an ambassador, which is widely believed in Indonesia to be someone that is in charge of carrying out regime change. Behind the scenes, in ways we still did not fully understand because of the files have not been declassified, MI6 and CIA begin to agitate for a clash between the very well-armed Indonesian military and the unarmed but very popular Indonesian Communist Party, knowing very well what happens when there is a clash between an armed and an unarmed group, in ways which are still much mysterious because the relevant parties will not tell us what they were doing at the time. This clash does come about in 1965. And immediately a general named Suharto in Indonesia seizes power, shuts down all communications outlets which the military does not control. And with the assistance of media in the United States and Britain and Australia and the United States government and the British government, spreads a propaganda story blaming the Indonesian Communist Party, which is now between 25 and 30% of the country, as I said, would have won elections if they were carried out, blames them for horrible crimes which never took place, including the castration and torture of Indonesian generals in a satanic, tantric, Marxist orgy. This propaganda story, spread with the help of Western powers, is used to justify rounding up approximately 2 million people. We don't know exactly the numbers because the international community has never been able to carry out a real investigation of what happens next. Indonesia certainly didn't, and the United States did not either. Around 2 million people are taken into jail. Communists accuse communists, ethnic Chinese, labor organizers, feminists, people in charge of cultural organizations. Often, many of the people that I met told me that they went into prison believing that things were going to be fine. They were just going to explain that they had nothing to do with whatever was going on in Jakarta. I'd be happy to talk to the police. It was people that were in the Communist Party associated with it, felt that they were fully legal members of society. They had nothing to worry about. They did have something to worry about, very tragically. Over the next few months, about 1 million of these people, perhaps more, perhaps less, were taken out of prison at night or taken somewhere secret and executed, thrown in rivers, discarded. Another 1 million stayed in concentration camps for people to be held specifically as a result of their political beliefs. In this moment, with 1 million people in jail for their political beliefs and bodies floating through the rivers of Indonesia, the United States government brings Suharto into the quote unquote free world. US business opens for Indonesia, and Suharto becomes one of the most important allies of the United States in the Cold War. Now, although we've forgotten about this event in the English-speaking world, people that were paying attention at the time, people that were paying attention to the Cold War at the time, understood that this was a very big deal. This was the most important unarmed socialist party, perhaps, in human history. This is the president who has been at the forefront of the Third World Movement, and basically, overnight, this country is flipped into the pro-Western anti-communist camp, and the PKI, the Indonesian Communist Party, has been eliminated. Now, for right-wing movements around the world, for allies of the United States, for potential allies of the United States, this was seen as something that could be copied. This was seen as something that worked, that could be perhaps implemented in their own countries. And if it were implemented, they would get the support of the United States government. So the first explicit instantiation of the word Jakarta to signify the mass murder of communists or accused communists comes in Chile and during the administration of democratically elected socialist president Salvador Allende. Far-right groups, which many of which have been funded by the United States, are carrying out a number of terror campaigns on the streets of Santiago. And one of them is to write on the walls of the street or to send out postcards to leftists or government employees or people accused of being leftists, Jakarta, or Jakarta is coming. And the message, again, was very clear for those that were paying attention. The message was, we're going to kill you, just like the Indonesians killed their leftists. On September 11th, 1973, very tragically, Jakarta did come to Chile. Pinochet takes power after the US successfully are able to assist in a coup d'etat in that country. Soon after, Chile, Brazil, and many other countries in South America form Operation Condor, as Rigoberta mentioned. Operation Condor countries throughout the 70s kill tens of thousands of people. And then in the 1980s, when Central America becomes the perceived problem spot for the United States, Operation Condor countries move into Central America and give tips on how to do the same thing. And across my, and this brings us back, of course, to precisely Rigoberta's own powerful story. But just to summarize, I found that across the entire Cold War, there were at least 22 countries in which the intentional mass murder of leftists or accused leftists was carried out, and that this was one of many methods used in the Cold War that really shaped the type of world that we got after it ended. So thank you for the opportunity to provide that context, and thank you for having me here.
Thank you so much, Vincent Bevins. I hope that everyone reads your book, as well as the Nobel Peace Laureate Rigoberta Menchú's book, I, Rigoberta Menchú. Now, Vincent, I wanted to follow up with a question and then turn to Rigoberta. And my question to you is the series of coups you talk about in the world that the US was integral to. 1953, you have Iran, and you have the US involved also at the behest of Anglo-Iranian oil, right? That becomes as the predecessor to British Petroleum, which is BP. You have Kermit Roosevelt, the grandson of Teddy Roosevelt, who comes with armfuls or suitcases full of cash, overthrows the democratically elected leader, Mohammad Mossadegh, 53. But Kermit Roosevelt refuses to do the bidding for the United States in 1954 of Guatemala, the overthrow of Guatemala. And I wanted to ask you, as we set the scene to go back to Rigoberta, about that coup, about the Secretary of State at the time, the corporate lawyer, John Foster Dulles, and his brother, Allen Dulles, who was head of the CIA. John Foster Dulles had represented as a corporate lawyer United Fruit. And many say that the democratically elected leader, Jacobo Arbenz, was overthrown by the United States on behalf of United Fruit. Do you share that analysis?
Yeah, that's a simple, to put it very simply, that I think that works. Yes. I think it's really interesting that you brought up Kermit Roosevelt's hesitance to be involved in 1954. I have the quote in the book, but it's quite telling, because you get this kind of thing happening throughout the Cold War. He says something like, after going through everything that has happened in Iran, he says something like, if the people don't want it, it's never going to work out, right? Like, if you try to shove something on the people of a country, you're going to get chaos afterwards. And you do get chaos afterwards in Guatemala. You do not have a stable government established by the coup of 1954. You have violence is immediately requested at the behest of the United States government. They ask the new regime to kill people. And United Fruit is incredibly influential in generating particular types of media coverage in the United States and lobbying the US government, both of which I think contributed to the ultimate decision taken by the United States government. I don't think they weren't pressing all the buttons. I think they really they had a lot of influence in the media. They brought journalists out. They showed them a particular side of the story. They were active in Washington, D.C. They had close friendships with the government. So yeah, I do think it's right to say that United Fruit pushed the United States government towards backing a coup in Guatemala. Wasn't the only reason they did it, but that simple version of the story I do think is accurate.
Mm-hmm. Which brings us back to Rigoberta Menchú. If you can talk about that history and your role, your seminal lawsuit to force accountability, talk about who you sued, Rigoberta, and talk more concretely about on the ground the terror that your family faced right through to 1980, when your father was burned to death with a number of others at the Spanish embassy in Guatemala. Who was responsible for that?
Bueno, es terrible pensar que para hacer una destrucción masiva se tiene que hacer un plan estratégico, se tiene que hacer una doctrina para poder usarla. Y eso es lo que pasó tanto en el mundo como en América Latina, que la violencia no ocurrió solo porque habían unos soldados malvados, criminales que se prepararan para aniquilar un pueblo, sino porque estaban obedeciendo un plan llamado contrainsurgente en Guatemala. Y ese plan empezaba por el descabezamiento del movimiento social, que había que descabezar los dirigentes sociales para tener el terreno libre, digamos, para ejecutar el plan contrainsurgente. Y mucho de lo que estaba en juego eran los territorios de los propios pueblos indígenas. Estaba en juego el territorio, estaba en juego los recursos naturales, los recursos minerales. Era el acaparamiento de la riqueza que poseen los territorios. Entonces, por eso es que se centró mayormente la violencia contra los pueblos indígenas, porque los pueblos indígenas tenían un sistema ancestral propio, que tenían sus propios liderazgos y que en lugar de aprender el idioma de los pueblos indígenas o reconocer su sistema ancestral, había que obligarlos a una política homogénea, pero quitando primero sus dirigentes. Realmente mi padre fue un dirigente campesino que buscaba mejorar la comunidad, que buscaba mejorar la semilla, que buscaba mejorar el uso de un territorio que actualmente sigue siendo un bosque nuboso. Ese bosque nuboso que tenía tanta vida, pues había que correrlo, y luego se mezcla con la mezquindad local, porque yo creo que hay personas a nivel local que estaban a favor de la destrucción masiva de los pueblos indígenas. Si la tipificación del delito de discriminación, el delito de la opresión, pero también el delito de etnocidio hubiera ocurrido y se hubiera aplicado, no habrían permitido tanta atrocidad en Guatemala, que fueron 446 masacres, según el informe de las Naciones Unidas, Memoria del Silencio, más de 200,000 víctimas. Entre de ellos también se encontraron niños, mujeres embarazadas. Se usaron métodos, por ejemplo, de usar a la mujer con objetivo de conflicto armado. No solo usar la mujer, porque la mujer siempre se ha utilizado como arma humana, como escudo humano en una guerra, sino usarla como símbolo de terror para que las mujeres piensen o para que los hombres piensen lo que podría pasar con su mamá, su hijo, su hija, si expresara una opinión. O sea, aquí el llamado anticomunismo fue brutal, fue algo extraordinario que lo podemos comprobar, porque nosotros empezamos a documentar, nos convertimos no solo en testigo de los crímenes, porque se cometió directamente con nuestras familias, como el caso de mamá. Mamá se dijo que fue torturada, está en una fosa común, pero después otros dicen que lo llevaron, lo tiraron en un cerro. O sea, crearon incluso leyenda alrededor de mamá. Y nosotros no podemos pensar uno u otro, porque realmente los testimonios que encontramos es que la criminalización de las lideresas fue un hecho planificado y fue un hecho que ocurrió realmente donde la mujer se quedó en una fosa común. O sea, yo no dudo que mi madre esté en una fosa común. Ahora, ese horror que pasó dejó también una secuela futura, porque en Guatemala hoy por hoy todavía se habla del anticomunismo. Todavía se acusa a un campesino de comunismo o de subversión, y la subversión era como un delito que te cueste la vida. Muy pocas personas vivieron en mi época y que pudieron alzar la voz. Yo no caminé sola, y realmente gracias a muchas personas que me dieron el espacio, que me acompañaron a superar esa situación muy delicada, muy difícil para el ser humano en particular, porque igual yo podría estar llena de venganza, llena de rencores, y podría continuar. O sea, la secuela de violencia. En Guatemala, gracias a la espiritualidad maya, que logramos superar en gran manera. Nos atrevimos a ir al tribunal no indígena, porque eso es lo más terrible en Guatemala. Tienes que ir ante un juez, unos códigos de ley, de justicia que no tienen nada que ver con uno, y que no hay intérpretes, y que siempre se ha dicho que los derechos indígenas no existen. Entonces, ¿cómo te defiendes ante un tribunal que te desconoce totalmente? O sea, pero yo inicié en el año 95 con el caso Chamán. Hubo una masacre, demandé a 26 militares con todos sus coroneles y sus capitanes que hicieron la masacre de Chamán. Y fuimos al tribunal militar. Y gracias a este proceso que yo llevé adelante, me presenté como querellante a favor de la comunidad, con los testigos de la comunidad. Nos volvimos investigadores, nos volvimos testigos, investigadores, querellantes. Empezamos a entender la lógica de la justicia penal y documentamos todo, incorporamos en el proceso 12 idiomas mayenses para que prosperara con éxito el proceso, y me tocó a mí abolir el fuero militar. Pero abolir el fuero militar no es sencillo, porque hasta la fecha me tiene tildado, digamos, como yo antimilitar. Y no es cierto, realmente hemos avanzado muchísimo en el diálogo, en tratar de ser tolerantes. Lo grave aquí es que la política norteamericana cayó los hechos, porque hay mucho testimonio que hemos encontrado que la documentación estaba precisamente en la embajada norteamericana. La CIA tenía información sobre los matones, y además existía la Escuela de las Américas. Creo que la Escuela de las Américas es un testimonio vivo de muchos militares que se graduaron acá en este país. Eso que estoy diciendo parece que somos antinorteamericanos. Y la verdad que no. Yo amo mucho a la gente aquí en Estados Unidos, y yo creo que la gente aquí puede regular el rol de sus autoridades. Creo que la gente tiene que asumir también que sus autoridades no funcionaron con humanismo en ningún país del mundo, y que esa carga se tiene sobre las generaciones. Pero nosotros acudimos a los tribunales, tenemos más de 500 casos en proceso penal. Eso es lo que quieren abolir ahora, porque quieren declarar amnistías generales del pasado. Solamente 5 casos que prosperaron en los tribunales. El caso de Ríos Montt, que es muy conocido. Llevamos un juicio contra Ríos Montt. No llegó a la sentencia, no, pero sí llegó a la audiencia.
The former president of Guatemala.
Exacto, la audiencia pública del tribunal. El caso de la Embajada de España, que no llegó a una sentencia porque el Estado no quiere asumir su responsabilidad, pero sí llegó a un tribunal de alto impacto. o el caso de Sepulsarco, o el caso del juicio Ixil, y entre otros. Hay algunos otros que ha prosperado. Pero digo que, ¿por qué logramos hacer eso? Porque tenemos a nuestro lado la verdad legítima.
Rigoberta, as you talk about having the truth on your side, what inspired you as a young woman? I mean, the fear, the horror before you. You were born in 1959. When you were about 20 years old, your younger brother was killed, followed by your father being killed. Talk about what made you decide to stand up when you knew the stakes, your mother disappeared, were so high. What was the turning point? Was there a turning point for you? I mean, we're speaking now at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. There are so many students just about your age at that time. What motivated you?
Bueno,
After all that you faced and all that you lost in your family, why did you keep going?
es muy difícil dar consejos, digamos. Simplemente yo salí de Guatemala muy golpeada, muy enferma y todo eso, pero gracias a las hermanas de la Sagrada Familia, que era un convento de monjas, que me ayudaron a salir al exilio. Vine al exilio como cualquier exiliado, incluso en este tiempo. Cualquier exiliado que se va, perdió todo, perdí conexión con toda mi familia, con todas mis hermanas, y solamente me tocó sobrevivir. Pero quizá lo más grande para mí fue el coraje que sentía por lo que pasó con mi familia. Y yo no podía callar eso. Yo me esforcé muchísimo por dar a conocer. A medida en que yo di a conocer, también fui formando un liderazgo, y ese liderazgo, gracias a ese liderazgo, 10 años después me dan el premio Nobel. Pero es una lucha constante, es una lucha de por vida. En esos años, yo creo que ninguno de nosotros pensaba luchar una semana, 2 semanas, sino no creíamos ya en el tiempo personal, sino creíamos que era importante alzar la voz. Muchas personas me ayudaron. Los hermanos indígenas de acá, de Estados Unidos, me ayudaron mucho para hablar, las iglesias, los grupos de solidaridad, los defensores de derechos humanos, las abuelas de Plaza de Mayo, Argentina, las comadres del Salvador. O sea, yo me fui asociando con la causa de experiencia común. Y me tocó la suerte de mis ancestros. Yo creo que los mayas de alguna manera me iluminaron. Yo creo mucho en ellos. Y seguramente el tiempo me fue marcando una pauta. Pero uno es la actitud. Yo creo que si nosotros nos quedamos como víctima, no podemos jugar un rol en contra de lo que estamos denunciando. Segundo, que la oportunidad. A mí me dieron oportunidad de compartirme muchas tarimas, y por eso aprovecho en la academia. O sea, actualmente yo soy profesora en la Universidad Autónoma de México, en la Facultad de Derecho, porque aquí es el derecho el que se rompe. Los derechos internacionales, los códigos internacionales, la autodeterminación de los pueblos, los derechos indígenas, el juicio que deben hacer los pueblos a su manera. Yo soy muy parte de todo esto, pero yo creo que somos muchas personas los que podemos hacer una agenda común. Yo rindo homenaje a la lucha común de las víctimas, a la lucha común de los testigos, la lucha común de los profesionales que pusieron al servicio de las víctimas su título académico, también la lucha común de los ancianos. Yo rindo homenaje al al sistema que está dispuesto a escuchar una verdad, aunque no esté codificado. Así que yo les felicito, yo creo que la actitud de buscar soluciones y es muy importante.
I want to encourage people to send in your questions and chat. I wanted to ask Vincent Bevins, follow up on a point that Rigoberta Menchú made about the training of soldiers at Fort Benning. I mean, it's so significant that although there were a number of trials in Guatemala holding Guatemalans accountable, where is the accountability for the backers of the murderous death squads and the paramilitary death squads in Guatemala, for example? Or, for example, the US role not only in toppling Sukarno, bring us Suharto, but moving on to Indonesia's invasion of East Timor and killing off a third of the population. But with Guatemala, it's so clear the line, not to mention your work in Brazil, the accountability for the American government. And if you can start off by talking about the role of Fort Benning, as one of the people in the audience asks, were they carrying out the Jakarta method there?
So, in the case of Indonesia, which is unique in the number of people killed, it is also unique in that even in Indonesia, there has been no admission to the victims that what happened to them was in any way wrong. The official story is still to this day that they deserved what happened to them. They're suffering. The survivors still face the stigma that was placed upon them in 1965. So there has not even been any kind of accountability for the people that admit to having carried out mass murder in Indonesia in 1965. Now, when it comes to the question of the United States, unfortunately, it seems to be that the position of the hegemon, the superpower in the global system, is that you're not held accountable for anything, right? I mean, it is incredibly rare in the history of the United States government since 1945 that anybody at the high levels of the US government is held accountable for crimes committed against people of the global South. There are some exceptions for crimes committed within the US government, violations of norms, but it seems to be that is what it is to be the hegemon. And in the case, responding more directly to that question, whether or not Fort Benning was doing the Jakarta method. In the case of Indonesia, we know that the US government and its officials were actively encouraging the murder of communists and people accused of being communists. In one case, someone from the US government admitted to passing lists of people to be killed in Indonesia, so those names could be crossed off and passed back to the United States government. We know that the Indonesian military was doing it because they believed that the United States government wanted them to. We know that the particular tactics that were used in Indonesia came to Latin America, including Guatemala, directly afterwards, including the use of disappearances, the kind of terror tactic that not only takes someone's life, but leaves their family and friends in a state of confusion about what has happened. This moves from Asia to Guatemala and Venezuela in 1966, and we know that there are U.S. officials that also were transferred in that exact same way. So the fingerprints of the United States government in many of these cases, as I said, there's 22 overall. In some cases, the United States government is clearly participating and assisting. In other cases, they're providing indirect support. In other cases, the perpetrators seem to be doing it because they know that they'll get away with it or be encouraged or be rewarded for having done so. But even in the cases where it's very clear that the United States government has been helping to carry out mass murder, there's no kind of accountability. And I think that says more about the nature of the global system that has been established precisely by this type of global intervention than it does about the amount of evidence we have, because the evidence is clear. It's the problem is with the very nature of international law within the system established by US hegemony since 1945.
And I'll follow up with another question from the audience. What's the connection between state crimes and the problems Guatemalans currently face, such as gang violence and poverty? And what would reparations look like for survivors of state violence? And let me add to that question, how would you link what happened in 1954, the US-backed overthrow of the democratically elected leader Arbenz, to the terror of the 1980s, the decimation of the Mayan population, like the family of Rigoberta Menchú, to the issue of migration and the Northern Triangle, the number of people who are fleeing these countries and their violence, the link from the US through, the through line.
Is that for me or for Rigoberta?
For you, and then I'll ask Rigoberta.
Oh yes, so absolutely. So the question of how life in Guatemala and the rest of Central America would be different if it were not for these interventions is so difficult, because it is impossible to imagine how many things would have gone differently if it were not for this particular type of intervention that started in the late 40s and 1950s. Everything would be different. I mean, everything that we can understand about the development trajectories taken by Central American countries in the last 60 years is somehow indirectly a consequence of US intervention. Specifically in the case of Guatemala, you mentioned that Kermit Roosevelt was reticent about carrying out the coup, another coup, because he said, this kind of thing wouldn't work if the people didn't want it. And in the case of Guatemala, you immediately did get chaos, which essentially is unbroken. I mean, you get the chaos changes in form, you get the different types of political problems from 1954 to the end of the Civil War. But there is basically unbroken link between what happens in 1954 all the way to the mass murder of the 1980s, which, as we both mentioned, goes up into the hundreds of thousands in Guatemala. Guatemala is the worst case behind Indonesia in terms of absolute numbers. And I'm sure she'll be able to talk about this too, but in every community that I visited in the Guatemalan highlands that had been decimated by the intentional mass murder in the 1980s, the residents that were there told me that they had friends or family in the United States, that they had people that had to go, not because they wanted to, but because the local economic opportunities had been decimated by the Civil War, because the human population had been decimated, and this was a way to get some money back into the community. So I think that you could draw a very clear line from 1954 all the way to the mass murder of the 80s, and then directly to the large waves of migration coming from Central America to the United States ever since then.
And let me put the question of reparations to Rigoberta. The whole issue of what reparations would look like for their survivors of state violence. What would you like to see, Rigoberta, happen at this point?
Yo creo que actualmente la recompensa debe ser que no vuelva a ocurrir ese pasado, que no se vuelva a intervenir en los procesos, las dinámicas a nivel local, a nivel regional. O sea, que ya no se cometan los mismos crímenes. Y luego, pues, que el reconocimiento del pasado es algo que debe conocer la juventud. No se debe ocultar el pasado. Desafortunadamente, en Guatemala ha habido mucha discusión sobre el desacreditar la violencia del pasado. Nosotros hemos sufrido muchos ataques diciendo que somos rencorosos, que no debemos de seguir insistiendo del pasado, que debemos de borrarlo, debemos de dejarlo allí. Muchos nos han desanimado para documentar el pasado. Pero también ver esto no como pasado. Hay muchos rasgos que hoy por hoy lo estamos viviendo, especialmente el crimen organizado, especialmente el narcotráfico. Todavía continúa ejerciendo la tortura, la desaparición forzada, a pesar de que estos crímenes ya están tipificados como crímenes de lesa humanidad, o el feminicidio. Hay muchos casos de feminicidio que ocurren actualmente como odio contra las mujeres y el racismo y la discriminación. Creo que si no se hubiera frenado el desarrollo global de los pueblos de América Latina, los pueblos indígenas, no estaríamos viendo la carga del racismo y la discriminación que hoy estamos sufriendo. Entonces, sí, el atraso mental, podemos decir, de la gente por causa de las invasiones, los conflictos armados, todo ese atraso que nos dejó, realmente nos ha hecho una vida muy dolorosa para mi generación y las generaciones que me siguen a mí. Las nuevas generaciones probablemente tienen la oportunidad de no olvidar el pasado y de basar su vida, sus decisiones en decisiones correctas a favor de la opinión de los pueblos, pero actualmente aún hay personas muy enfermas alrededor. Aparte de otros, por ejemplo, la pobreza extrema sigue ocurriendo en las áreas que fueron de conflictos, porque eran como laboratorios especiales las comunidades. Los convirtieron en laboratorios del horror. Las ex patrullas de autodefensa civil, por ejemplo, en Guatemala, aún continúan controlando a varias zonas del país. O sea, no es que se haya acabado. Yo pienso que no. Existen esos rasgos, existen. Y lo usan las mafias corporativas actualmente. La impunidad, por ejemplo. Vemos en Guatemala la impunidad con mucho acento, el ataque contra los líderes comunitarios, la criminalización a los dirigentes, la criminalización a la lucha por la tierra o territorios, pero también la impunidad. Creo que la impunidad es una herencia del pasado que lo estamos llevando en nuestros hombros, desafortunadamente. No sé si respondí su pregunta, pero yo creo
Yes.
que hay mucho que
Let me ask this question. It's from a national anarchist mutual aid organization, the Trans Asylum Seeker Support Network. How can US-based grassroots organizations best build solidarity with and for the resistance struggles of Indigenous people, of Indigenous Mayans, anti-imperialist struggles around the global South? And that question was repeated in different ways by a number of people, how American students, for example, can best show support. Let's ask both of you, starting with Rigoberta Menchú.
Bueno, yo pienso que nuestra bandera de lucha por la vida no solo fue porque tenemos la suerte de tener un testimonio tan fuerte que nos tocó ser protagonista y tenemos la suerte de tener una voz, sino también nos asociamos a las luchas diversas de la sociedad. Yo creo que es todo lo que vino después de la Guerra Fría es la firme convicción de que la diversidad es una riqueza de la humanidad y no es un problema de la humanidad. La diversidad étnica, la diversidad cultural, la diversidad de pueblos, la lucha por la autodeterminación de los pueblos, la lucha porque la intervención abusiva de los colonialistas del pasado pues debe terminar, y sobre todo por la concientización de que somos un ciclo de tiempo. No tenemos que acaparar todo lo que en nuestro tiempo existe, sino tenemos que pensar que la humanidad continúa su rumbo. Y más para mí que ahora veo el señor finado Reagan, ya no está, muchos de los perpetradores de crímenes de lesa humanidad afortunadamente terminó su tiempo en la tierra y ya se fueron. Es decir, no tendrían que haber sido perpetua con malos ejemplos. Podrían haber dejado una huella maravillosa para la humanidad. Entonces, creo que el tiempo también es reciclaje, pero yo sí apoyo todas las causas. Yo creo que no tengo que decir que soy parte de la diversidad, porque la diversidad se ejerce. Yo lo ejerzo a mi manera. Tengo fuerza espiritual, tengo identidad maya, hablo mi idioma, admiro mis abuelos mayas, admiro la ciencia ancestral a través del sagrado calendario, a través del ejercicio de la espiritualidad ancestral. Y eso debemos de hacer todos. Usemos nuestra identidad propia para construir un mundo más incluyente, más justa, menos racista, menos de fobia, menos extremo. Y creo que estamos logrando en buena medida, aunque los problemas son serios, especialmente la migración, la falta de educación oficial, la política educativa sigue siendo excluyente, a pesar de que no tenemos los mismos derechos ante la salud y ante la sociedad en general. Pero hemos avanzado mucho. Y yo creo que la esperanza de un mundo mejor, pues lo estamos construyendo en realidad con nuestro ejemplo, nuestras huellas y nuestro trabajo.
And Vincent, if you can expand on, I want to combine two questions. This issue of the documentation of solidarity struggles and the importance of their role in taking on state terror. And also a question about history education. Why is the history of US state terror not taught in schools?
Yeah, so just to add quickly to what she said, I agree with everything. It's very important to be in touch with and support whatever causes around the world that you also believe in. And I think an easy way to answer that question is to listen to what the actual indigenous groups say that they need, whatever that may be. In the last few months, I've done some work with either the APIB, the Associação de Povos Indígenas do Brasil, APIB, or Univaja in Brazil. These are both indigenous-led groups. Univaja having spent a lot of resources tracking down the body of my friend Dom Phillips and Bruno Pereira, who was working with indigenous people in the Amazon. They needed money, and they said, we need money. So then if you are in a position to just give money to indigenous groups doing important work, that is something that as citizens, if you're a citizen of the first world like I am, and you have the ability to do that, that helps. In the last few weeks, I tried to raise some for an organization in Indonesia, which just pays the basic costs of life of the survivors of 1965. It's Secretariat Bersama 65, Sekber 65. I also I posted about that somewhere. But I mean, the basic answer is to, if you're learning about struggles around the world that you sympathize with, find out what they say that they need, because it varies, and often the best way to help is just to give them your money and let them decide what to do with it. The question of history education is a really important one as well. I think that if we do not, as Rigoberta said so eloquently at the very beginning, establish the truth of what has really happened, we're at real risk of not only doing damage, further damage to the victims, but of reproducing the types of violence that was so important to structuring the type of world that we live in now. So I think that we should push in every way possible to make sure that this history is uncovered, first of all, because we're not even done uncovering it, and that it remains taught to the next generation and broadcast around the world. As to why it is not taught enough, that is a question, I think, about the function of education in sort of an advanced capitalist society. There is some kind of a role to form a certain type of citizen, and the certain narratives get excluded, which are inconvenient to the powers that be. But that is something that is not a lost cause, you can push back against that as much as possible. You can fight that battle on the margins to get as much of the truth told as is possible. And I think that's really important work.
You know, it's really interesting to ask this question now. This isn't the topic of this conversation, but in this week of the mourning for Queen Elizabeth II, and all the, especially in the United States, extolling of the monarchy, the lack of education we have of the perspective from the colonies, from Jamaica, from Barbados, from Kenya, from Nigeria, from places like Antigua and Barbuda, how important the role of the media is in telling a story from all sides, and what colonialism means. And I'm wondering about that, Rigoberta Menchú, how you were able to harness the media. And if winning the Nobel Peace Prize in 1992 elevated your story to change the narrative about Guatemala. I mean, the reports done on the killings of hundreds of thousands of indigenous people in Guatemala, this wasn't equal, right? This wasn't two sides fighting a war. This was a mass slaughter in your country.
Muchas gracias por preguntarme. La verdad no soy una estrella de los medios de comunicaciones. Me ha tocado lidiar también con un sistema muy, muy duro en Guatemala, donde llega un momento en que solo se me preguntaba qué pasaba con el dolor, el sufrimiento, pero también qué pasaba con los victimarios, y casi que me querían convertir como vocero de los victimarios. Y en ese sentido yo me tuve que resguardar de los medios, porque no me daban el espacio digno, sino simplemente tenía que ocultarme prácticamente. Gracias a la tecnología, valoro mucho la red social. Valoro muchísimo la red social, porque la red social me permitió a mí decir lo que quería decir y no lo que querían que dijera. También creo que es muy importante la sensibilidad. Si somos sensibles, seguramente vamos a encontrar nuestra vocación humana, el momento en que defendamos la vida, que valoremos la vida, que valoremos otra persona, su modo de vivir, su modo de pensar. Entonces, realmente hemos creado nuestros propios mecanismos de comunicación. Afortunadamente, los mayas de Guatemala tenemos 23 idiomas y yo solo hablo el idioma quiché y no hablo otros idiomas de los mayas y hablo el español. Entonces, eso me obliga a tener que ser humilde en el momento de querer entender el dolor de la gente o la manera que quiera perdonar el pasado. No solamente decir perdón por todos, no. Señores, hay que preguntarles a ellos si entienden ese tipo de perdón que quieren los otros o simplemente tienen su propia manera de querer resarcir ese pasado con su propia vida y sus propias generaciones. Así que yo estoy trabajando muy bien, yo uso mucho la red social. Actualmente incluso el TikTok es muy importante porque nos pone inmediatamente en un espejo mucho más grande que antes. Pero antes fue la soledad total. Yo creo que nosotros vivimos el silencio, la soledad muy fuerte, a pesar de que muchas personas eran solidarios, nos daban hospitalidad, nos daban cariño, pero el mundo entero no podíamos llegar ahí. Entonces, para mí el libro Me llamo Rigoberta Menchú y así me nació la conciencia, es un gran embajador que rompió silencios en cualquier lado del mundo. Por eso valoro lo escrito también. Ojalá que más personas puedan escribir y a medida que escriban en cuentos infantiles, en largometrajes, en videos, en todo lo que se pueda hacer y en papel, es muy importante para preservar la memoria, preservar la dignidad de las víctimas y enseñar todo lo que significa la memoria colectiva, que todo lo que pasó en una comunidad no es solamente dolor de una víctima, sino también es el dolor colectivo. Y bueno, trabajamos en eso. Nosotros estamos muy vinculados a la juventud.
Dr. Menchú, a question from the audience. You mentioned how Mayan spirituality helped the Mayan people to overcome the aftermath of violence. Can you explain the specific beliefs that helped? And in general, what should an affected people do to address collective trauma?
Bueno, hay una parte de mi vida y de mi trabajo, es precisamente la espiritualidad ancestral. Yo termino buena parte de mi vida construyendo sitios sagrados, construyendo altares cósmicos, llegando a ejercer bastante en la medicina ancestral, tanto medicina psicológica, emocional, para limpiar el cuerpo, limpiar las ideas, pero también la medicina de plantas medicinales, los baños de flores, los baños de planta aromática, el sagrado fuego. Yo creo que los mayas usamos mucho el sagrado fuego para purificar nuestras mentes, purificar nuestros ojos, el silencio, la meditación, el acompañar las víctimas en sus propias ceremonias. Hemos hecho muchas ceremonias. Espero que los jóvenes de la Universidad de Massachusetts un día puedan venir a Guatemala y compartir con nosotros una ceremonia ancestral. Tenemos un centro Pachaj que está a 39 kilómetros de la ciudad de Guatemala, donde hacemos ceremonia con jóvenes, con adultos, con personas que han vivido algo especial, pero también gente que agradece la vida. No solo enfermos llegan a nuestra espiritualidad maya, llegan personas muy iluminadas. Entonces, yo practico, tengo mi forma de hacer mi espiritualidad. Es muy lindo, porque es como darse tiempo para que uno deponga lo negativo en su justo lugar y uno pueda florecer en el interior de uno mismo, todo lo que pueda hacer en su misión en la tierra. Yo tengo una misión en la tierra y estoy dispuesta a trabajar por esa misión, por la conciencia humana, y eso hacemos. O sea, yo he llevado procesos penales, he hecho investigaciones, he hecho vocera, facilitador de diálogo, de negociaciones, pero también tengo una profunda oportunidad de desarrollar mi espiritualidad y quiero ser maestra de maestros porque eso es mi misión. O sea, en la espiritualidad maya es muy importante ser maestro de maestros.
I want to thank you both so much for being part of this discussion. And Rigoberta Menchú, your bravery is immeasurable and inspires awe in everyone who hears you and reads your story. And I hope everyone will read Rigoberta's book that she was just talking about, I, Rigoberta Menchú. What a remarkable life story Rigoberta has led and continues to lead. And I want to also encourage everyone to read Vincent's book, a very important book about US imperialism and imperialism in general in the world. His book called The Jakarta Method, Washington's Anti-Communist Crusade and the Mass Murder Program that Shaped Our World. That does it for the first event of the Feinberg series, Confronting Empire, a year-long series from the University of Massachusetts, the UMass Amherst History Department, and the Ellsberg Initiative for Peace and Democracy, and partners bringing together scholars, journalists, and activists, exploring global histories of US imperialism and anti-imperialist resistance. You can register for further events on their website, umass.edu/Feinberg, Feinberg. And if you want to continue to hear the stories of grassroots activists and their immeasurable bravery around the world, democracynow.org is a great place to go for a daily grassroots, global, unembedded, independent, international investigative news hour across the week, hearing people telling their own stories as we go to where the silence is. Big thank you to the organizers of this event. I'm Amy Goodman. Thanks so much for joining us. And thank you to Vincent and Dr. Rigoberta Menchú Tum.